The Unpaid Ledger. Season 2, Episode 9. Fall Costs. Chapter 1. I came in before April, which I didn't usually do, and sat at my desk with my coffee and the quarterly intake forms I'd been meaning to file for 3 weeks and tried to be a person who did paperwork. The bracelet was warm at my pulse and quiet, and I was working at keeping it that way. The math wasn't complicated. Marcus had laid it out for me at the corner of his block in February light. Involuntary sensing moved the clock in days. Active work at range moved it in hours. I had done both in the past week. And the clock was somewhere it shouldn't be. And the thing that was listening was closer than it had been when Marcus had first described its habits. The smartest thing I could do was sit at my desk with my hands around a mug and let the bracelet rest. Eddie was in the armchair across the room. He'd been there when I went to bed, and there when I woke up. Which was the shape of his nights in the apartment. He didn't sleep, had no reason to move, and sometimes I'd find him in a different position by morning, which told me he did something with the hours I wasn't watching. This morning he'd been at the window when I got up and in the armchair by the time I came back from the kitchen with the coffee. He said good morning when I sat down, and I said it back, and we were easy enough with each other that neither of us felt the need to fill any space beyond that. I'd been at the forms for 40 minutes when April came in at 8:15 with the morning mail, her bag, and a coffee from the place on the corner that meant she'd been up long enough to need a second one. She didn't offer information about her morning, and I didn't ask. She went to her desk and sorted the mail without looking at me. And I went back to the forms. And for a while, the office was just 2 people working in adjacent rooms. I'd come to appreciate that about April in a way I hadn't been able to articulate for the first year she'd worked here. She knew when to fill the space and when to leave it alone. And she'd gotten better at leaving it alone lately, which may or may not have been a comment on the past few weeks. Then she came to my door. "Walk in," she said. She sat in her car for 20 minutes before she came up. I asked how she'd found us. Found your card in her father's things when she was clearing his desk. Father died 6 months ago. I asked what she was experiencing, and April gave me the short version, a run of bad luck since the death. The kind that didn't quite add up to grief alone, professional things. Small things compounding sideways. She'd found the card 2 days ago and hadn't known what to do with it. And then she'd done this. After April went back to her desk, I put the intake forms down and stood at the window, the quiet drill position I'd been working since the Alderton week. Pick a target, hold the target, let the rest fall to ambient. The woman in April's chair came through the wall at 30 feet. Nothing on her that was hers in any ledger sense. Just drift. The kind that accumulated on people who had been living near something heavy long enough for it to start moving. When I had her clean, I told April to bring her in. Her name was Jo Ward. Late 30s, dark coat, with the particular kind of tired in her that had been going long enough to become her baseline expression rather than a temporary condition. She sat in the client chair without putting her bag down, which was someone who hadn't decided yet whether this was going to be worth the drive, and I didn't try to decide it for her. She had her father's watch in her coat pocket. She told me that herself before I asked, which meant she'd brought it deliberately without quite knowing why. I asked if I could look at it. She set it on the desk between us. A plain watch, the utilitarian kind that outlasted fashion if you wound it consistently, case-worn smooth at the edges. Crystal with a scratch across the face that had been there long enough to look like part of the design. Jo said her father had worn it every day since she was small. And I believed her without needing the bracelet to tell me, because 40 years of daily wear had its own kind of signature that didn't require any particular ability to see. I picked it up. The bracelet had the residue off it before I'd finished closing my hand. Not Jo's, not anything in the room. A man's whole working life, complete and clear, brought to me through the metal and leather of something he'd worn against his pulse every day, as clearly as if he'd been sitting in the client chair instead of 6 months in the ground. I set the watch back on the desk. My hand stayed where it was for a moment after I let go. That was new. The bracelet had picked up people through walls and across parking lots and through objects that had functioned as cost vessels. But a cost vessel was a container, a deliberate receptacle. This was a watch. Something a man had owned and worn, nothing more. The bracelet had found the mark he'd left on the world through an object he'd used every day, and brought it back complete. And I didn't have a framework for that yet. I pulled my hand back and asked Jo some questions while I sat with it. How quickly the bad luck had started after her father died. Whether it had been consistent or in waves. Whether it touched the same areas of her life repeatedly or moved around. She answered with the precision of someone who had been paying close attention for 6 months and knew the pattern better than she wanted to. And then, without my having to ask directly, she told me about the accusation. Embezzlement from the community fund he'd managed for 22 years. A formal board referral in the last month of his life. Walter Ward had collapsed 3 days later, and the investigation had not outlasted him. It had simply stopped when he did, unresolved. His name attached to it permanently in the records of an organization he'd given 2 decades of careful work. He didn't do it, Jo said. It wasn't a question, and it wasn't a plea. It was a statement of fact she'd been carrying for 6 months without anyone in a position to verify it having confirmed it. I told her I knew that. The watch had given me enough to know it. She sat with that for a moment, a stranger confirming what she'd known without being able to prove, and I let her sit with it. Because it was worth sitting with. I took the case. I told her I'd need to see her father's things, and she gave me the address on Kendall Street. And I got her coat and walked her out, while April watched me over her monitor with the look that meant we'd be having a conversation about this later. When Jo was gone, April went back to her mail. I went back to my desk and sat down. The watch was still there. Eddie was watching me from the armchair with the patient attention he brought to moments I was going to have to explain. "You're keeping it," he said. I turned the watch over once in my hand and put it in my coat pocket. "Yeah," I said. "I'm keeping it." Chapter 2. The Kendall Street address was a brick row house on the north side that had been subdivided somewhere in the 60s and never quite settled into what it had become, the kind of building that kept trying to be a single-family home and kept failing at it in ways that showed in the layout. Jo had the second floor. I parked on the street and sat in the Taurus for a moment. Not working the drill. Just letting the bracelet stay at whatever temperature it had come to rest at on the drive over, which was warmer than I would have preferred. Eddie waited without making it a thing. I told him I'd be an hour. He said all right, and I went up. Jo had her father's things in the back bedroom she'd been using as storage since she'd cleared his apartment. 2 boxes of his office files, his reading chair, a framed letter of commendation on the floor against the wall with its face turned toward the room. 32 years of service, it said, because she'd taken it out at some point and not found a place to put it back. And I knew that without asking about it. I looked at it for a moment before I looked at anything else. I worked through the room with the bracelet, doing what it had been doing for 2 weeks, finding things at range, flagging them, bringing them to me, while I kept my hands in my pockets and moved through the space without touching anything. What it found in Walter Ward's boxes and chair and framed letter was a man who had been steady across 4 decades of work. The ordinary costs of a working life came through clearly, the small redirections that everyone accumulated, the times he'd taken the easier path when a harder one would have served the fund better. There was a dinner he'd charged to the fund once, years ago, and felt guilty enough about that the guilt had stayed present in the residue, the way guilt sometimes stayed when a person didn't find a way to forgive themselves for the small things. He'd padded hours on reports twice in 15 years, and both times had felt bad enough about it to stop. Nothing in there read like embezzlement. Nothing had the texture of a man who had taken what wasn't his in any systemic way. His reading chair had more of him than the boxes did, 40 years of sitting in the same place to think, to work through the fund's annual reports, to make notes in the margins of things that needed attention. People left more of themselves in the places where they did their quiet work than in the places where they performed. The chair had his habitual posture in it. The weight of a man who sat with his back straight, even when no one was watching. And it had his patience. And it had the quality of attention he'd brought to the work, the kind that came from actually caring whether the fund's books were correct. Not from worrying about whether anyone was checking. Walter Ward had cared about doing the job correctly for a very long time. More than most people cared about any job. And then, laid over all of that, the other thing. I stopped in the middle of the room and didn't move for a moment. Costs that a person had actually earned were fibrous, integrated, threaded through the structure of who they were. You pressed against one and felt the resistance of a life organized around it. This was nothing like that. This sat on the surface of Walter Ward's residue the way a nail sat in the wrong wall. It was present, it had weight. But it wasn't of him. It wasn't attached to anything he'd done. It was attached to something external, to a moment specifically. The moment when someone had stood up at a meeting and said Walter Ward's name in a formal accusatory context and been believed. And the believing had done what institutional believing did, which was make a thing real regardless of whether it was true. I walked the perimeter of the room once more and let the bracelet finish the picture. The manufactured cost had been running off its attachment point for 6 months, bleeding into the people nearest to Walter's residue, which was Joe primarily, because she'd been closest, because she'd taken his things into her apartment and lived with them. Not a targeted placement. Just what happened when something stayed attached to a person's residue and the person wasn't there anymore to absorb it. It spread to the nearest available surface. Joe was waiting in the kitchen doorway. I gave her what she needed. Which was the shape of it without the full mechanics. Her father had been carrying something that wasn't his, something that had latched onto him when an institution made the accusation official. And it had been moving into the people closest to her father's memory ever since. That was why her professional life had been compressing. That was why the small things had been going sideways. It was going to keep doing that until someone pulled it. She listened and didn't interrupt. Which was how she'd gotten through 6 months of something she didn't understand, by listening carefully and not interrupting even when the information was difficult. He knew, she said, when I finished. Yes, that it wasn't his. She wasn't asking, she was confirming. He knew, I said. I can tell from the residue. He had a clear and complete knowledge of his own conscience right up to the end. He carried this thing because there was nothing he could do about it, not because he believed it. She looked at the floor of her father's storage room, at the commendation letter propped against the wall, at the boxes of files. She was doing the quiet, private work of integrating something she'd needed for a long time. I gave her time to do it. I asked where the board vote had happened, and she said the Mallory Street Community Center. But her father had collapsed 3 days after the vote and died at St. Mary's and was buried at Elmwood. Elmwood was familiar. I'd worked there once before under different circumstances, and I knew its quality. Some ground held settled things more cleanly than other ground. Costs fixed at death. They gathered to a permanent point, and Elmwood was where the permanent points had accumulated for a century and a half, which gave the place a density that practitioners could feel and that most people just read as solemn. The manufactured cost would have fixed there when Walter Ward died. That was the deeper root. The board meeting moment was where it had started, but death was where it had locked in, and the lock was at the grave. I reached for my coat. The bracelet flagged something at the edge of its range. Not Joe. Not a neighbor. Not anything with the texture of cost residue, human grief, or accumulated consequence. Something further out, and moving, and carrying a texture that was wrong in a way that had nothing to do with the ledger system, a categorical difference in what the surface gave back. Like metal against wood under the same palm. It held in the bracelet's range for 1 beat and then was gone. I finished putting my coat on. I said what needed to be said to Joe, The work would be done in the next few hours. She'd feel things shift over the next few days. She should call the office if anything changed. She thanked me at the door with the kind of gratitude that came from someone who had not expected to be helped today and was still working out what to do with it. I went down to the street. Walter Ward was a decent man who'd carried something manufactured to his grave, and I knew where the root of it was, and I knew how to get there. That was the case. What had been at the edge of the range was not the case. I put those two things in separate compartments and left the second one there. I sat in the Taurus. Eddie was in the passenger seat watching me settle. I started the engine. "You caught something in there that wasn't hers," Eddie said. "Yeah." He waited for more. I pulled out of the space and headed south toward Elmwood, and he let it go. Chapter 3. Elmwood ran along the eastern slope of a long ridge that kept it in afternoon shadow most of the year. I came in through the Crescent Street gate, which I knew from the last time I'd worked here, and parked in the same lot near the maintenance building. The path crew had laid salt that morning, and the gravel was still damp and darker than it would be by tomorrow. The trees were bare. A cardinal was on the fence near the gate and watched me go through without moving. Eddie came with me without discussing it. I found the Ward stone in the newer section of the old part. Granite, simple. Walter's name and dates and nothing else. No epitaph. A Christmas wreath wired to a shepherd's hook in the ground beside it that nobody had taken down, which Joe probably hadn't gotten around to, and which I suspected she'd leave until the weather made it look like more of a ruin than it already did. I stood a few feet back from it. The bracelet was warm before I got close. I worked the approach as I'd been learning to work approaches since the Alderton job. Pick the target, hold the target. Don't reach ahead of what the bracelet was already doing. Walter Ward's residue was thicker here than it had been at Joe's apartment, more concentrated. Costs gathered when they'd had time and a fixed point to gather around, and the grave was both. The ordinary costs of his working life were deep and settled. The manufactured cost sat on top of all of that, still external, still wrong, still carrying the wrongness I'd found on Kendall Street, but more fixed now, pressed down into the earth with everything else at the moment of death. I found the edge of it, pressed against it from the angle where the attachment was thinnest, where the false anchor hadn't had time to work its way any deeper before Walter Ward died, and the whole thing locked. It didn't release at first. That was wrong, on its face. A manufactured cost shouldn't grip. That was the principle the bracelet was about to teach me. But this one held. Not with the fibrous resistance of a real cost, but with a stubbornness I hadn't expected. The false anchor working harder than I'd given it credit for. I shifted angle and found a different edge and pressed again. The bracelet was running hotter than it had at the Alderton work. Hotter than I'd let it run since the foundry crystal, climbing toward the line where running hot stops being a metaphor. The Christmas wreath at the foot of the stone moved once in still air, settled, and didn't move again. I pushed harder. The ground beneath my right foot gave. Not a lot, half an inch. Maybe an inch, but it gave. And the soil over Walter Ward's grave was February hard everywhere else. And the place where my weight was settling was suddenly soft. I pulled my foot back, and the soil firmed up under it again. I stepped a foot to the left and pushed against the false anchor from the new angle. The ground there gave too. The cost was pulling at me, not at the bracelet but at me, through the work. 6 months of accumulated institutional belief that had nowhere to go, no real foundation. No person left to sit on, looking for any anchor it could reach, and the practitioner standing on its grave was the closest one. I held my position, which meant fighting the soil under my feet from doing what the cost wanted it to do, and pushed harder against the anchor. The cost released, then it came at me. Not a thought, not a metaphor. A direct snapback of weight that should have gone nowhere and came at the nearest available practitioner with the structural intent of a cost that had not yet acknowledged that it wasn't real. The bracelet ran hotter than it had ever run, fast and bright, and the force redirected before it landed. Most of it. A small piece caught me at the shoulder, on the right side, where the bracelet's coverage thinned at the joint. A short, sharp heat, through the coat, through the shirt under it, into the skin, like a soldering iron held against me for a quarter of a second. Then it was over, and the cost, the bulk of it, the weight, had nowhere left to go, and finally understood that and unraveled. The structure of it came apart in a way I had never felt a cost come apart before. Not absorbed, not redirected, not dispersed into the soil. It simply ceased, like a knot that had been tied wrong. And when you found the thread that was holding the wrong shape together and pulled, the whole thing fell into loose cord. There was nothing underneath the false attachment to sustain the form once the attachment was gone. A manufactured cost did not have the structural integrity of a real one. I stood with my hand on the headstone and felt the burn at my shoulder, small but real, and thought about what had just happened. Two new things, in the same minute. The ledger knew the difference between a real cost and a manufactured one. A cost built out of institutional belief applied to a false premise was not, in the end, a cost. The mechanism didn't move it, because there was nothing real to move. Pull it off the false anchor and it dissolved. That was the first thing. The second was the bracelet. It had a function I hadn't known about, and the function was protection. It had taken the snapback and redirected it before it could land. Not cleanly, the burn was the proof of that, but it had caught the bulk. And the practitioner standing on the grave hadn't ended up wearing 6 months of someone else's false guilt. That was worth thinking about. I filed both somewhere I could find them later. The bracelet went tight. Not heat, pressure. A sudden tightening from the direction of the tether. From the end of the bracelet that ran toward Eddie and through Eddie toward the in-between. My right arm went numb to the elbow for the duration. It lasted 2 seconds, definite and deliberate. And then released, and the bracelet went back to warm, and feeling came back to my hand. I put my hand flat on the headstone to keep my balance. Stayed there longer than I wanted to. My phone rang. April. She asked how the ward case was going, and I told her it was done. She told me I wasn't supposed to be working this week. I said she was right. And I meant it. And the brief quiet on her end was April filing it for a conversation later. She gave me a message about a regional coordination call next month from a practitioner in the Millhaven area. And I said I'd return the call. She said all right and hung up. February afternoon in an old cemetery, and the work was done. Walter Ward's manufactured cost was gone, not moved, not redirected. Just gone, and Joe Ward would feel the difference over the next few days in ways she'd probably attribute to something else. I was fine with that. People found frameworks for what happened to them, and the framework mattered less than the fact of it. I went back to the Taurus. Eddie was in the passenger seat. I got in, pulled the door closed, and turned to say something and didn't. His shoulder. The fold of his jacket where the collar turned, which had been holding individual threads clean in the light since October, which I'd stopped commenting on because commenting didn't change it, and he knew I noticed, was soft. Not the brief thinning I'd caught during the Alderton pull. The 2 beats where I'd been able to see the bookshelves through where his shoulder had been. This was more. Through where his shoulder should have been, I could see the headrest of the passenger seat, clearly enough that I couldn't write it off as a trick of the afternoon light. I looked directly at it. It came back, the way these things came back when attention settled on them, his shoulder going solid again. The threads of his jacket returning. The edges of him going clean. He met my look for 1 beat and then looked out the windshield. And I looked out the windshield too. The shoulder where I'd taken the burn was tight under my coat. The bracelet was warm. The Cardinal had left the gate, and a car went by on Crescent Street, and after it the silence came back and stayed. Chapter 4. I didn't start the engine. Eddie knew why I wasn't, and he went first. The pocket had been different while I was working at the grave. He said it the way he said things he'd been sitting with, no particular emphasis. Just the things stated plainly because it needed to be said. Not the frequency, not the ocean's movement when costs came in, pressure from the wrong direction. From the cost system side of the in-between, pressing inward against the pocket wall. It had held for the length of the work at the grave and released when I stopped. I told him about the 2 seconds of tightness on the bracelet. Same duration, same moment. We'd felt the same event from opposite ends of the tether. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then he asked about the catch at Joe's apartment. He'd caught something in my face when I came back to the car on Kendall Street and had been waiting since then. I told him, the edge of my range, one beat, wrong texture. Nothing that had the shape of cost residue or human grief or accumulated consequence. Something else, gone before I could hold it long enough to know what it was. He asked how long ago that had been. I looked at the stone wall along the cemetery's edge, the bare trees beyond it, the gray of the afternoon going flat. 2.5 hours between Joe's apartment and here, with the drive between them. Whatever had been at the edge of the range on Kendall Street had been following the signal. It had been there on Kendall Street. And the bracelet had gone tight at Elmwood. And those were the same event measured from different angles. So it moved, Eddie said. Yeah. He was quiet for a moment, working through what that meant. From where he sat in the in-between, he had a different picture of the geography of the thing than I did. He'd felt it pressing against the pocket wall, which gave him a direction and a pressure that I didn't have access to from my side. I asked him what direction it had come from. He thought about it. He said it had felt like it was coming from the same side. The frequency did not come from the cost system side, pushing in toward the pocket, rather than the other direction reaching through. Not from the realm, from this side of the in-between, which meant it was already here, already in the world Sam worked in, and had crossed through from somewhere else to get there. That sat with me for a moment. The work? Eddie said. Yeah. Every time you run the bracelet at range, Eddie said. I know, I said. I know the math. He let that sit. He wasn't wrong, and we both knew he wasn't wrong, and there wasn't anything useful in going around it. I'd taken the Ward case knowing the math, done the pull at Elmwood knowing the math, and it had moved the clock. The Alderton week had started the clock, and the Ward case had moved it, and I was not going to be able to do this job as I'd always done it without the bracelet running loud enough to find. That was the shape of it. I'd known that since Marcus's walk and hadn't found a way to change it. I caught something in there that unraveled, I said. The manufactured cost. When I pulled it off the false anchor, it just stopped, didn't go anywhere. Just stopped being a cost. Eddie turned that over. That happened before? No. What does it mean? Eddie asked. It means the system knows the difference between something real and something manufactured. A cost that was never legitimately placed doesn't have the structure to sustain itself once you find the right edge. I looked at the headstones visible through the windshield beyond the lot, the gray rows of them going back toward the ridge. Walter Ward carried that thing for 6 months because there was no edge available to find. His daughter's been carrying the drift of it ever since. And now it's done, Eddie said. Yeah. It tried to snap back when I pulled it. I rolled my right shoulder under the coat. The bracelet caught most of it, got me a little where the cuff couldn't reach. Eddie was watching the bracelet, or the place on the gray space side where the bracelet was. I saw it do something I hadn't seen it do. Wasn't sure what I was looking at. New function? Protection. Glad it has that, Eddie said. Me too. Eddie didn't say anything else for a moment. He had his own kind of quiet for sitting with something that had been worth doing. And he sat with this, in that quiet. He'd always been good at that, at recognizing the shape of something that mattered without making a speech about it. Joe's father was a decent man, I said. Because that was the case. And the case had been worth doing. And I needed to say it to someone. Yeah, Eddie said. I got that. 22 years of clean work. He patted his hours twice and felt bad about it for the rest of his life. That tracks, Eddie said. Something like him carrying something manufactured to the grave and having it run off onto his daughter for 6 months. I stopped. There wasn't a way to finish that sentence that added anything. It was wrong. The case had been worth taking because it was wrong. I'd known that from the watch. Eddie said. Yeah, quietly. He'd understood what I was not quite saying. We sat in the cemetery lot while the afternoon turned gray around us. The heater was doing its best. Which was not its best. The Taurus had an adversarial relationship with February on a good day. I had my hands on the wheel without any intention of starting the engine yet. And Eddie had his hand flat on his knee. And neither of us was going to be the one to say the other thing. The radio came on. Not the gray space frequency. I knew the frequency by now, the quality of it, the patience of it, the sense of something that had been traveling a very long time and arrived carefully rather than quickly. This was not that. This was 3 seconds of sharp interference. A high mechanical edge to it, like a tool dragged across the inside of a metal box. The sound was not the worst part. The worst part was the direction of it. It was pointed inward, at the passenger seat, at the space where Eddie was sitting. The temperature in the car dropped, not metaphorically. The windshield fogged in 3 seconds and cleared in another 3, and the radio cut. Eddie went still. Not the open, attentive stillness he used when the frequency found him, when he was waiting for something to resolve out of the signal into meaning or direction. This was different. This was the specific stillness of something that has just understood. It has been located by something that was looking. The radio cut, and the silence came back. That was not the gray space frequency. The frequency was patient and old, and came from the other side of the in-between toward Eddie because it had always been coming, and was in no hurry about the distance. What had just come through the radio had not been patient and had not been coming from that direction. It had been looking, specifically at the passenger seat, at my partner. And I had spent 4 hours that afternoon generating the signal that had told it exactly where to look. Drive, Sam, Eddie said. He hadn't taken his hand off the dashboard. I put the Taurus in drive. Eddie's hand moved from his knee to the dashboard, not gripping it, just resting there. The same gesture he'd used in the car on Wednesday, the one that meant he was holding something still. His shoulder was solid in my peripheral vision, the collar of his jacket clean in the last of the gray afternoon light. I didn't look at it directly. I'd looked at it directly once and it had come back. And looking at it again didn't seem like the thing to do right now. Neither of us said what the interference had been. Neither of us said what the tightness on the bracelet had been. Neither of us said that the thing at the edge of the range in Joe Ward's apartment, and the thing that had pressed against the pocket wall during the pull, and the thing that had just looked through a car radio in a cemetery parking lot, were the same thing, and that it had finished what it had been doing on Kendall Street and now knew exactly where Eddie was. We knew all of that, saying it wouldn't have added anything. I pulled out of the cemetery lot and onto Crescent and drove east. The radio stayed quiet. The heater ran. And the city came up around us as we got further from the ridge. Lights coming on in apartment windows as the afternoon let go. And Eddie had his hand on the dashboard and was looking at the buildings going by. And I had both hands on the wheel and was looking at the road. There was a conversation we were going to have that was not going to be tonight. Tonight, I was going to drive home and make something to eat and look at the bracelet and think about what Marcus had told me about the progression and try to do the math on what the afternoon had cost me in terms I hadn't fully worked out yet. I drove home, and the radio stayed quiet the rest of the way. And I didn't say what I was thinking. And neither did Eddie. And we left it there.
Chapter Guild, Stories for Your Mind.